I really want to welcome, I am Beth Meinert. I'm an officer here at MITRE and one of the leads for MITRE's Great Power Competition Special Initiative effort. And I'm so excited to welcome everyone here to this speaker series on space power. For those who might not be familiar, MITRE is a not-for-profit company who operates in the public interest. And over our last over 60-year history, we have operated federally funded research and development centers for the government. The focus of our work is solving problems that are complex problems that each of our sponsors come up against, but also taking on those problems that have a whole of government or whole of nation complexity to them and try to develop, say, a win-win solution. And it's because of that I am so excited and pleased to welcome our guests, which cover so many aspects of this important issue that we're going to dive into today on space power. So again, I want to welcome everybody and turn it over to Will Kirkman, who will talk about a little bit about our global power competition effort.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Beth. This is Will Kirkman from MITRE. Again, welcome everybody. Pleased you could join us today, and welcome all the guests from both inside and outside of MITRE. This year, MITRE initiated a new strategic initiative, and this is year one of the 3-year effort, really focused on identifying arenas of competition where the U.S. is competing with global powers and global interests. And MITRE really wanted to help decision makers understand U.S. objectives, other nations' objectives, how those may be in cooperation, competition, or conflict, how to think about then developing and understanding potential courses of action across whole of government that could be used to advance U.S. interests. And then evaluating those for efficacy and to directly inform policy decisions and action. Certainly one area of both cooperation, competition, and potentially conflict is the space area. It's increasingly and always is important from a national security perspective, but also critically important for commerce and the economy. And then there's been great cooperation historically in the scientific domain in space. So we thought it was very important to have a discussion on space power overall. And so we welcome today an esteemed group of panelists to have a discussion about space power. And I want to turn it over now to our moderators. I'll lead with Nate Daly. So Nate, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Beth. Welcome, everyone. MITRE has a unique vantage point as a not-for-profit working in the public interest, and it allows us to provide impartiality in convening important discussions from across public, private, and academic domains. Space has become an increasingly multidisciplinary domain. It's not just for rocket scientists anymore. This implies that we all increasingly share the vulnerabilities of not just the astrodynamics risks associated with orbital debris or traffic management, but also around the normative landscape of behaviors among states and independent actors alike. In the context of the Great Power Competition discourse, and with the vision of making the world and space a safer place, we presented the panelists with 3 prompts to choose from for today's discussion. As the audience has a chance to review the slide that's being shared, I'm privileged to present our distinguished panel, who will each provide 5 to 10 minute opening statements, followed by a Q&A at the end of the final panelist remarks. Dr. John Klein is a senior fellow and strategist with the Falcon Research Incorporated. He's also an adjunct professor at George Washington University Space Policy Institute. He literally wrote the book on space power 3 times. His most recent book, titled Space Warfare in the 21st Century, Understanding Space Strategy, the Art of War in Space. Todd Harrison is the director of the Aerospace program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Namrata Goswami is a former Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace, genuine social scientist in the group. She specializes in great power attitudes towards resource nationalism, territoriality, and expansionism in the space domain. Frank Rose, Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Security and Strategy Team in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute, is also prior to that served as Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control Verification and Compliance, and is the U.S. signatory for the report from the United Nations Group of Government Experts on Transparency and Confidence Building Measures for Outer Space, a foundational document for the more recent United Nations Long-Term Sustainability Guidelines for Outer Space. Dr. Mir Sadat, we are very fortunate to have today. He's a former policy director on the National Security Council and a distinguished and prolific Great Power Competition Spacepower author. Dr. Brian Whedon is the Director of Programming and Planning for Security, the Secure World Foundation, and conducts research on space debris, global space situational awareness, space traffic management, protection of space assets, and space governance. And to help with the Q&A from the audience, our co-moderators, Dr. Kevin Toner of MITRE, Dr. Brad Townsend, and Paul Szymanski, both prolific and distinguished authors in space strategy. So let's begin. Dr. Goswami, would you like to kick us off, please?
Thank you, Nate, and thank you, MITRE, for this opportunity. So in the next 9 to 10 minutes, what I'm going to do is not only address the 3 questions that was put forward, but there are also another 3 set of questions that the MITRE panel pointed out in their advertisement, and that is, what is power, how is it gained, how is it lost, and who are the countries actually looking at it? So I thought offering a conceptual framework would kick off the discussion in a way that addresses some of the concerns that we have today. So the first point that I would like to make is that the structural and ideational context for how outer space is perceived is changing across the world, not just within or between the great powers. So for instance, we have the African Space Agency put out its African Space Vision 2063 that looks at space from a very economic perspective and commercial perspective. We have China talking about space utilization in the next 20 years. And an example is that during the Apollo era, we saw a lot of flag and footprints conversations where you go to space, prove that you can get somewhere first and then come back. And so not in terms of sustainable presence, but in terms of showing short-term presence. Today, it's much more about establishing a sustainable permanent presence in deep space, for instance, on the moon. So you can see this reflected in China's space program. So for instance, Ye Peijiang, who actually kicked off China's lunar exploration program in 2002, the lead thinker in this particular area, he argued actually in 2002 that for China, the moon is important for not just for showing off a flag and footprints model, but also in terms of the potential for extracting the resources of the moon for enabling China's national rejuvenation. One of the most important thinkers in this perspective is Xiang, who is the head designer, and he's seen as the father of the Chang'e programs. He actually reflected that again in 2016 by arguing that it's really important that we understand the tremendous capacity of the moon to sustain China's spacefaring capacity and as well as develop its economic potential. So he pointed out that the moon could serve as a new and tremendous supplier of energy. Now, what is interesting is that a country like India, who is also a great power in space, depending on its capacity, has identified the potential of deep space resources. For instance, when the Indian Space Research Organization's Chandrayaan-1 actually helped NASA find or locate water on the lunar surface, the ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization scientists, put out a statement, and that was actually 12 years ago, which pointed out that the comprehensive evidence for lunar water coming from surface, subsurface, deep interior, and exosphere is very exciting for future space exploration and travel. If the moon could be considered as a pit stop for resources, including water, space transportation, which can become more affordable as we continue studying this, including extraction capability, humanity can actually become a truly spacefaring civilization or species. Now, what is interesting from a policy discourse today is that Even in the US, you see a change of discourse reflecting in policy documents. For instance, the National Space Council put out the New Era for Deep Space Exploration and Development on July 23rd, in which it encapsulated the vision of US space program as a campaign to utilize Earth's orbital environment, the surface and resources of the moon, and cislunar space to develop the critical technologies, operational capabilities, and commercial space economy necessary for a sustainable presence, human presence, on the moon, Mars, and beyond. And what is interesting from a space power perspective, which I'll get to in a bit, is that if you look at the new capstone doctrine of the United States Space Force, they point out that as we look to the near future, orbital flight efforts access to an immeasurable supply of economic resources. These resources represent untapped economic opportunities that further elevate the value of the space domain and the imperative for orbital flight. So you can see the shift coming from the great powers to include the US, China, Russia, which recently announced interest on the lunar resources, India. And what is interesting is that the structure within which these great powers are actually competing or even thinking of cooperating is not just themselves, but the larger context of space, which has changed today. We have new space actors, we have middle powers like UAE and Luxembourg talking about their importance in terms of space. So it's a very interesting world that we are in. The amount of conversations I have with students in South Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East about space is actually changing the entire discourse within which we as great powers function. Now, what is space power? Some of the questions that the MITRE panel pointed out, or the questions that they posed in their panel advertisement was that, what is space power? So this took me back to my graduate studies on power as a political scientist. So Robert Dahl in 1957, in his book, The Concept of Power, offered us a classic definition of what is power. So power is A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. So power then is not solely a matter of getting B to do something that B does not want to do, but can also be a matter of preventing B from doing what B wants. Now, what is interesting is that there are different phases of power. And so Foucault, who would argue that power actually exists in all aspects of state relations, including space power. We cannot, you cannot shy away from it. You have to deal with the context of power in state relations, which are basically human relations. And then there is another interesting concept of power, which says that power is not just about broadcasting power, but also your capability as a country to stop another country from putting forward an agenda, say in the United Nations General Assembly, from getting voted. So do you have the power to ensure that some countries cannot get hurt and some can? So by extension, what is space power? Space power is an extension of comprehensive power. It's the ability to persuade or coerce countries to behave in a manner in space that is beneficial to the first country who's actually projecting that power. The other important point is that space power is also the ability to deter a country from not doing something that is not beneficial to the particular state's national interests. Brent Zernick, who's a colleague of mine, gives a very simple definition of what space power is in his book, Developing National Power in Space. He points out that space power is the ability to do something in space, taking from Brigadier General Billy Mitchell's definition of what air power was. Now, in terms of the space power of Space Force doctrine, how do they define national space power? So they define national space power as the totality of a nation's ability to exploit the space domain in pursuit of prosperity and security. So what is so interesting is a very Clausewitzian understanding of war as a policy by other means. So war is not the end in itself, or warfare or development of capability is not an end in itself. It is what you are actually pursuing in terms of great power, prestige, identity, and capacity. So now, how is it attained? I would argue that it is attained by additional leadership and will. It's attained by a country's ability to deny others access to space and its resources. As John Klein in his book points out, space strategy is the ability to deny access or to have access to and in space. So that's what it's really focused at. It's an ability to establish relationships to share space access and resources, especially your value systems, and to make sure that your value system triumphs vis-a-vis someone else. You can see this kind of reflected in some of the activities that countries like China are doing. For instance, China would utilize its Belt and Road Initiative, including the Space Information Corridor, to establish itself as a lead power in space by 2045. You can see that in the national legitimacy building in terms of supporting and financing some of the United Nations activities in space. And then what is interesting is that given the fact that the moon is the focus for, say, countries like China, India, Japan, and now the US, cislunar power projection becomes extremely important, because not just for the moon's value to Earth, or to go there and establish a flag, but because, as you saw from the conversations coming out of scientists and policymakers in China, India, Japan, the moon has intrinsic resource capability. Bao Wenbing pointed out that the moon has about $10 trillion possibility of revenue return in the next 30 years, and that's why we're going to the moon. How is it lost? I think space power is lost when there is a failure to develop the economic underpinnings of space power and hard power, underestimation of competitor nation. So in a sense that, for instance, there is this conversation, especially in US strategic circles, that China is only following US capability or competing with US technology, say in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. Now, when I spoke about this in China, in Beijing, in a round table where there were representatives from the party school, from China National Space Administration, they actually basically said that US is right, we are just following you. We are not doing anything innovative. So it's very interesting when I kind of put it in a strategic perspective. This is exactly what you see in terms of Sun Tzu's advice, that feed into your competitors' misperception of you, that we are actually not innovative at all. Now, the other important point is that you can lose space power if you fail to galvanize your society. So in terms of if you lose electoral support, the electorate really matters in terms of taxpayers' investment in a particular facility. And so it's important that that kind of conversation continues. And more importantly, if you do not locate space power and the understanding of space within an understanding of critical infrastructure. So that's something that China actually has done. So this year in April, the China National and Development Reform Commission included space power within the concept of critical infrastructure for China's desire or the biggest important need to become an important player in space. Now, finally, I would say that in terms of who are the countries that are actually investing in space power? So for instance, space capacity, military power projection, orbital presence, anti-satellite weaponry, ability to go to the moon, not just once, but several times using reusable capability. Of course, the United States is the lead nation in terms of it wanting to do that. You have NASA recently announced a willingness to even buy resources from the moon as a proof of concept in terms of regulatory mechanism. China has actually demonstrated that willingness and desire to do that as well. And so what I am trying to point out is that whatever countries are investing in terms of space warfare, space power, space capacity, it's very important for us to understand that the end goal, the structure within which it's actually happening is changing. And so I'll end by saying that my classic definition of grand strategy. So grand strategy is the highest level of national statecraft that establishes how states prioritize and mobilize their military, diplomatic, political, economic, and other sources of power. Some nations pursuit a grand strategy towards a particular end, including space power and strategy, is for their own survival. But I would argue that countries like the US, China, and India, and to an extent Russia, are actually pursuing space power towards establishing a specific regional or global order. So I think I'll end there, Nate. And
thank you. Thank you, Dr. Goswami. Audience, let me please remind you, if I hadn't already, the Q&A button is at the bottom right of your panel there. Please use the Q&A to pose your questions, and we will get to those after the final panelist has spoken. With that, Todd, would you like to go next, please?
Sure thing. Thanks, Nate. And I want to thank the whole MITRE team here for sponsoring this discussion, because this is really an important topic. that, you know, we need to have more dialogue amongst the broader space community about. I want to start with talking about the term space power. I think that this is a term that still makes some uncomfortable, particularly in other countries. So I think when we use it, we need to be careful to convey that this is in the context of military power. And we're talking about it in the same way that we talk about power in other domains. Like, people don't get upset when you talk about air power, or when you talk about ground power or maritime power. We need to, you know, make sure people understand that when we're talking about space power, it really is in that same context. And related terms, space superiority, things like that, space dominance, it's got to be taken in the same context that we talk about air superiority and air dominance and all the other domains. I want to commend, first of all, the Space Force for putting out this document. I don't know if you can see it here. You know, the capstone document that came out with back in June on space power. You know, as General Raymond, you know, himself would say, this is really a starting point to help enable this discussion about how we develop a coherent, fully fleshed out doctrine of space power and how we're going to use space in the future of warfare. Ultimately, I think military space power and space warfare is really about being able to take away an adversary's ability to fight. You know, to quote Sun Tzu again, as a previous panelist did, really it's about, you know, the objective of war. The object of war is to disarm your adversary. It's not to destroy them. It's not to kill them. It's about disarming them, taking away their ability to fight. Certainly other countries view it this way. You look at what countries like Russia, China, to a lesser extent, Iran, North Korea, what they're doing with counter space weapons is they're developing these systems to hold at risk US space assets because they are an enabler for all of our other power projection forces. They view counter space weapons as a way to disable or diminish our ability to fight effectively in the future. So I think, you know, we've got to start thinking more about space power in this context. Now, we also need to begin to reconcile how space is viewed by others and within the US government. And I'm going to lay out some categories. I know there's a lot of ways, a lot of different ways of categorizing this. These are not meant to be mutually exclusive categories because you can view it in multiple of these ways at the same time. But I think it's useful to just acknowledge, you know, when we're viewing space in a certain context. So the first way I think space is viewed is as an information domain, as a way of collecting and transmitting information. And for much of the space age, that has been the primary function of our space assets, is to do remote sensing and to do communications. And, you know, in all sorts of different forms of remote sensing, whether, you know, it's SIGINT, RF monitoring, electro-optical imagery, radar imagery, or whatever the case may be. And then communications of all kinds, whether it's wideband, narrowband, protected, strategic communications, all of those. I think when you view space through this, you know, information domain perspective, it becomes very closely joined with cyber. It becomes very, very much a part of, you know, what we call our joint all-domain command and control. And, you know, I look at China in particular, and I think China, to a certain extent, very much views space as an information domain. I think that's reflected in the way they've organized their space forces, with space being part of the strategic support force, you know, really co-located, co-joined there in the organization with their cyber forces. I don't think that's the only way that China views space, but I think it is a predominant way that they view it. Another way of viewing space is as a physical domain, where you can take physical actions in and through space, where their space maneuver is important. And, you know, this perspective on space, I think, leads some people naturally to start looking out beyond Earth-centered orbits to look at cislunar space, and in particular, strategic choke points or strategic, you know, important points in cislunar space. I think another way of looking at space, an overlapping way, is it's an enabler for other domains. And to be honest, a lot of people in the US military still view air power in this way, that it is primarily an enabler for other domains, and space obviously is as well. You know, that this view of space, I think, focuses on how it can support other forces. And in particular, I think there's evidence that other countries, particularly, you know, China and some of their public statements, I think they view their counter space weapons, actions that they would take in space, really as part of a penetration aid, if you will, for their strategic missiles. That they view this as a way of directly countering advances in US missile defense systems. And so a lot of these forces and domains really start to overlap. And, you know, we've got to be cognizant of that. Now, I think the right way to view space is in all of these contexts, and understanding that it is both, you know, part of the information domain. It is a physical domain where physical actions and maneuvers do matter, and it is also a key enabler for other domains. Now with that, looking forward, I think we've got a great opportunity right now with the stand up of the Space Force, with that, you know, recruit, train, and equip function that it has, and the reestablishment of the United States Space Command as the combatant command that will take the Space Forces and use them in real world operations as part of a cohesive joint force. I think we've got an opportunity here to start thinking about roles and missions for space going forward. I think you look back at the past, you know, 30, 40 years, we really have not taken on new roles and missions for space within the US military. It's been somewhat stagnant. We have certainly advanced progress and we've advanced capabilities in some of these existing roles and missions, but we haven't done a lot to take on really new mission areas. And I think that there are some existing military missions that in the context of the national defense strategy and the refocus on great power competition, these are things that really could be done better from space. And this is primarily because of the growing threats we see, making other domains, particularly the air domain, increasingly contested and making it increasingly hard for our airborne assets to operate in this future threat environment. So in particular, you know, looking at things like the JSTARS mission and the AWACS mission. So JSTARS, you know, one of its main functions is to do ground moving target indication. AWACS is doing airborne warning. Those platforms, you know, the Air Force has recognized they are sitting ducks in a highly contested environment. They cannot fly those aircraft near the threat areas because they're really not defendable. How do we do that mission in the future? And you are somewhat limited with your stealthy penetrating platforms because you don't want to be broadcasting because you could give away, you could defeat your own stealth by doing that. Space actually provides a really great way to do those missions, using things like synthetic aperture radar on satellites with very large, highly proliferated constellations. You can start to provide those same types of services, ground moving target indication, airborne warning and control from space-based assets. You can also do more of what we do today from ground-based and sea-based radars for missile tracking and target discrimination, which is a key enabler for the effectiveness of our missile defense capabilities. You can do more of that and you can do it better in many ways from space. And you know, that's one of the things that the Space Development Agency is pursuing right now with our highly proliferated LEO constellation for missile sensing. You know, in many ways, I think space is an ideal domain to take on more and more roles and missions in great power competition because it gives you range, it gives you global coverage. And a big part of great power competition is the peacetime competition. And space allows you to overfly contested areas, to overfly your adversaries routinely and without provocation, because we already established back in the 50s and 60s that you have free overflight in space. So you can do that and you can continue these functions and these missions even in peacetime all the way up through and into the initiation of conflict without the mere overflight, without the mere use of these assets being a provocation in themselves. You know, and I think we should start looking at, are there new mission areas, things that we don't even do today that we could potentially do with some of these future space systems. Things where you could do, you know, persistent, wide area, ubiquitous coverage for RF monitoring, for SIGINT, for radar imagery, providing this kind of persistence, wide area coverage that we can't necessarily do today, but we could do with large constellations in the future. And what would that mean for the warfighter? What kind of new capabilities would that enable for the joint warfighting community? So, you know, what I want to close with is to really think through this and to really take advantage of all of the opportunities that this unique situation affords us. The military's got to sit down and really rethink how roles and missions are allocated across the military services. The last time we really did this was after the Air Force was created in 1947. You know, they had the Key West Agreement that started to allocate who's going to do what among the services. We're at a point now where we don't necessarily need to have a completely new Key West Agreement, but we are, with the addition of a new service, we are going to have to do some reallocation, and it shouldn't just be between the Air Force and the Space Force. We need to be looking more broadly across the joint force at really who should take the lead in different roles and missions. I'll close with one that I would posit that needs you know, more discussion. Right now, the Air Force has made, you know, JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control, a real priority mission, and it's really taking that on and trying to take the lead on it, and that's being implemented through ABMS, Advanced Battle Management System, which they've already been, you know, earlier this month they did a big demo of that. I look at the future of ABMS and I see more space in that. I see an increasing role for space, and I wonder, maybe that's something that really needs to be going to the Space Force. So with that, I'll stop talking and turn it back over to you, Nate.
Thank you, Todd. Mir, would you like to go next, please? You're on mute. Hold on. There you go.
Hey, good morning. So apologize, I'm fighting for bandwidth with 3 other inhabitants of my household. So it's sort of like a cislunar battle right here in my household. And I want to thank you for hosting this. I want to thank the other participants. I think so far the discussion is very fruitful. Hopefully I can add to it. Just a quick disclaimer, I don't speak for the US government or the administration's policies. These are all my personal perspectives. And so I'm only supposed to be held accountable for it. So I think one of the things we need to think about is crisis, right? Within each crisis, there's also an opportunity at the end of what we are currently experiencing virtually because of the global pandemic. I think we're going to see a slew of economic winners. You already see Russia using some of that sort of Cold War mentality by naming their new vaccine Sputnik 5 or 4. So they're drawing on some of those parallels, trying to return us back into that Cold War stance. The discussion today about great power competition is very much along the lines of that. So one of my things that I've been pushing for and asking for is that America really does need a national level industrial / technology vision policy instead of strategic goals to start making strategic investments that correlate with literally our way of life, what we're accustomed to, and what we've had to change in the last few months, our economic well-being, and of course, our democratic norms and values to shape the strategic environment of not just the next decade, but the decades to follow. And I'll explain a little bit where my thought on that is. And really, it comes down to sort of a binary position. America can either prepare and posture to shape the future where we have, the United States has a leadership, and we support our allies and partners, and they support us, or we can resign ourselves to a follower status. And that would be the first for us. And in that potential future scenario that we would be the follower status might mean being subservient to perhaps high technology, authoritarian-led economic systems. And so we need to, in the last decade and last years, we've been playing kind of what we call catch up. I think Eric Schmidt has been talking about that in the last year or so as well. So, you know, America's arsenal of democracy has declined. Some parts of it is due to feeling really comfortable after the peace dividends of the 1990s, and part of it was due to our priority focusing on counterterrorism. we were laser focused on terrorism, and we should have been, which is good. But terrorism is a real but not an existential threat to our nation or to even our European allies and some of our Asian allies. So during this period, many people, especially have an economics background, some of my economist friends declared the Cold War over and said basic competition is over, and now it's time for collaboration and interdependence and so forth. Not going to get into that argumentation. However, the reality is that competition is back, and that great power competition is now the manifestation of that competition. And I would argue that it never went away. In the last decade, China and Russia have really challenged and pushed globally accepted norms, values, laws across all domains: land, air, sea, cyber, space. You see it everywhere, right? So we are now sort of moving this big, heavy bureaucracy to focus in the last few years on correcting that with strategic investments. Some of it is just not feasible because of our other priorities, especially with the focus on domestic issues, right? And so these new investments are important because our way of life really are vitally dependent on this. I would say high technology, such as cyberspace, electronic warfare, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other emerging technologies are really vital to our way of life, what we've been used to and accustomed to. And trying to take away Wi-Fi or your phone from your kids, all hell's going to break loose in your house. You'll have an insurrection. So these technologies are all part of the incipient digital age, right? And the investments needed for this competition are already surpassing, by projections, our investments in counterterrorism measures, and are starting to now resemble the Cold War era figures, right? However, our economy is severely constricted because of the global pandemic. And so we need to be very innovative, be very thoughtful, and find new ways of doing business and doing planning. To do things differently, we really do need to evolve the 20th century industrial age planning and policies to the 21st century digital age. And the last 2 weeks, some of these different conferences where military senior leaders have spoken kind of confirmed that. And we must build the most advantageous ethical, most advantageous industrial structures with policies that promote our S&T industries, that broaden our market to take advantage of the economies of scale and also support our national interests. We must, now that we are looking like we're going back to the Cold War, we must return to things we did during the Cold War, such as publicly financing and also continuing to encourage venture capital investments and innovation and basic research. This is a must. I'll explain why later. Our global competitors, as you know them, operate under different economic policies and practices that really disadvantage our American companies, right? And when they disadvantage American companies, they disadvantage Americans, right? And so that's a big issue for the whole nation. The U.S. market-driven system does not benefit from free markets that can, as a free market cannot benefit from funding schemas and financing techniques that state-controlled systems employ. And so we need to start looking at this, because overall we are starting to weaken as a global competitive power. I know that's probably not a sexy thing to say, but and what's going on is America's scientific and technological advantage also will be lost in less than a decade because other nations will crest over us if we don't make those necessary investments now. And so, like I mentioned, the pre-Sputnik days of GDP percentage, R&D, S&T investment, we are at that level, the pre-Sputnik days. We are way beyond Sputnik shock, right? We are in a different, complete plateau. And so our global competitors are now filling that gap. They're investing heavily in innovation research. And with that ability, they will be able to influence our allies and partners. And so this will challenge us tremendously. So I get that 2-minute warning. I will skip down a little bit. And So really, it's our turn to start planning, right? And what we need for space, as I want to apply this to space, we really need to start thinking about a 2060 American space vision and strategy, right? We need to think about space as normalize it as a domain, just like the other domains. We need to think about commerce, civil exploration, and conflict occurring within that same domain, right? Potentially, and we need to develop a host of actions that expand our view from the terrestrial focus, open up that aperture to the cislunar environment, right? We should not just focus on preventing China and Russia from participating in this area, but we should encourage them to start accepting the norms and behaviors, and also have punitive measures in place that we can place on them. What I really believe is that we need to find a way to exit this great power competition. We can't maintain it. It was very costly, and the only way we can do this is if we move faster than everybody else. If we look at exponential advancements rather than incremental. Incremental will allow our competitors to catch up to us within a year, to 5 years, to 10 years. Exponential means that it will take a couple of generations for them to catch up. And our adversaries or competitors, whatever you want to call them, or partners, and others are trying to do that. And China's actually trying to do that. They're trying to be exponentially beyond us at the starting line at go. So unless we start doing that, the inhabitants of the space domain, the explorers of the space domain, those with their foot on the soils of the different planets, they will have the key advantage. And I really disagree with those who think that China would be better for humanity in space than the United States. I think that the entrepreneurial spirit that American capitalism has, with all its flaws, and our society has with all its flaws, it's the best one for expanding humanity the fastest and buying us the bulk we need in case something strategic happens here on the planet. And that's only going to work if we have a cislunar perspective and get on orbit and on the moon and on Mars before any nation can establish even a set foot. Anything short of that would drop us back into great power competition and drain our resources. So we need to have these strategic investments now so that we can leapfrog everybody else. And that would also provide us the terrestrial advantage that we would need in defense of the planet and of our nation. And I think, like Todd said, Space Force is going to be integral, how it plays in with Space Command and how Space Command, their Unified Command Plan expands, how they will employ the Space Force. But, if we're not going to be in space because we're not going to ensure freedom of action and operation, then we might as well tell PACOM to pull back fleets from the South China Sea. We might as well tell CENTCOM to pull back the fleet from the Strait of Hormuz, because space is just as relevant as those locations. And our national policies that we develop that will be enacted in the next 5 to 10 years need to really focus on 2060, a sort of linear path with allowances for corrections. Because our adversaries, our global competitors are doing that. China has already has a 30-year cislunar plan. Where's ours? We don't have one. So we really need to step it up. The importance of this would also mean that millions of jobs would be created, that those that would join the workforce, we would be lifting people up. If we employ the right techniques and measures, we could, empower various different demographic diversity pockets, and also diversity of thought within this industry. And the space industry could be sort of the shining model for what America is in the 21st century. So with that, I want to stop because I know I want to give everybody else a chance.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadat. Those are very good points on the nuanced differences between Anglo-capitalism and Sino-capitalism, and there's a lot of scholarly inquiry into that over the past year or two. So with that, I think that's a good segue over to Professor Klein. Would you like to go next?
Good. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank MITRE and my fellow panelists and moderators for participating to today's event. Standard disclaimer, The views expressed are mine alone, don't represent GW, Falcon Research, or the US government necessarily. So I'm going to talk deterrence theory, but before I do, before I put you to sleep, I'm going to give you the bottom line up front. So the United States has the wrong strategy when addressing competition with China in space. This is mostly the result of mirror imaging that the United States does upon others, and also an incomplete or segmented view of deterrence. So I'm going to try to answer your questions that were part of the prompt. What do you feel are the most salient challenges facing the whole government? So what's the problem? You know, you're seeing the discussions. Folks have been thinking about this for a long time. We have the Defense Space Strategy, Space Forces, Space Capstone publication. There's still one critical area lacking, and that's a strategy that looks specifically at the growing competition between China and the United States. Again, that competition, I'm not painting China as an adversary, but I think a competitor is a good word. China and the United States have fundamentally different approaches to strategy and deterrence. These stark differences have resulted in what I call strategy mismatch or misalignment, which diminishes the U.S. ability to attain specific policy objectives. To remedy this, I'm not going to just admire the problem. I want to give you walk away with some do-outs or some actionable items. The United States should move towards a comprehensive space deterrence strategy, which includes more of our allies and also commercial partners, and provides benefit for achieving U.S. policy goals in both peace and war. So I was looking at the folks, the participants, and there's some folks out there that have written on deterrence theory, mission assurance. So I'm going to give you a very abbreviated model for deterrence. I found it fascinating, but I understand not everyone would. So, you know, Western deterrence theory has its underlying basis that the threat of credible or overwhelming retaliatory action against an adversary would be sufficient to deter most from conducting hostile actions. We call this deterrence by punishment. The visual I would provide is two boxers in the ring. I would do a Rocky IV thing, but I date myself. But one boxer is bigger than the other. You don't mess with me or there'll be consequences. In contrast, deterrence by denial refers to the capability to deny the other party any gains from the behavior that is deterred. Glenn Snyder called this back in the early 60s the power to dissuade. And it does not depend upon the threat and capacity to impose punishment via military force. So deterrence by denial or dissuasion can seek two different but related outcomes: discouraging military competition in the first place and conveying the futility of military action because the desired objectives cannot be achieved. So the main reason for the mismatch is a propensity for US planners and policymakers to mirror image. So we think folks share this Western view of deterrence theory, this very bifurcated. But Sir Michael Howard, British historian, noted there's a social dimension to strategies development. In this case, China has a different view, a fundamentally different view. So China's deterrence strategies seek to achieve political results, and deter approaches are thought of holistically in order to provide national leadership a coherent national deterrent. So again, serving political ends, that's consistent with a lot of what we've been saying here. Strategic deterrence involves all the components of comprehensive national power, which includes military forces, economic power, diplomacy, scientific and technological. The goal of all these deterrent activities isn't to deter into itself, but is to directly affect an opponent's interest to compel him to submit to Beijing's will. Also, China doesn't explicitly differentiate between deterrence by punishment and dissuasion. So what happens there is you're going to have both coercive and dissuasive elements, and that can leads to a problem which will come up shortly. Also, deterrence and warfighting are not seen as opposites. In the United States, we think deterrence up to conflict and then something else. So there's no indication China's leadership has pre-existing messages to convey to an opponent when conflict escalation is intended or not. So if you mix dissuasion and compellence, you in theory could use military force to convey the submitting to Beijing's will, where China is not seeking escalation. But Western thinking in the United States, Article 51 of the UN Charter, inherent right of self-defense. Someone does something else and would go right up the escalation ladder. It may not be in the United States' best interest to escalate if we see a military action. Lastly, China is not interested in space deterrence, deterring an adversary from acting specifically within the space domain are acting against space assets. Instead, China's political leadership seeks to exploit space-related systems to achieve certain political and military aims largely on Earth. So it's deterrence through space and in all aspects unified approach. And I think we heard similar comments. We'll go briefly over, we have this model. So what's the problem? US, through mirror imaging, US policymakers conduct cost and position analysis from a perspective of Western or value approach. And they seldom take into account the value differences caused by historical preferences and historical experience. Keith Payne noticed this was in fact what happened in the Cold War when we mirror imaged against the Soviet Union, and folks thought we had it so wired that it almost, deterrence functioned almost automatically. That was not the case. The Soviets had fundamentally different perspectives on loss of life and what they consider a value. Similarly, deterrence in space domain and defense planning efforts should not be based on reflecting US values associated with costs and dissimilar opponent. And second, there's another mistaken belief that deterrence stops working when conflict starts. I'll quote the Defense Space Strategy, but it's in other documents. It says, Department of Defense will deter aggression and attacks in space, and if deterrence fails, be capable of winning wars that extend into space. So this idea of deterrence fails implies that there's deterrence efforts are inconsequential during conflict. Deterrence ultimately is about affecting the decision calculus of an opponent, and you can definitely do that even while you're in conflict. Because deterrence efforts may include all the instruments of national power, well, non-military or military, a whole government approach to deterrence during conflict can help prevent the escalation through economic measures, facilitate diplomatic off-ramps for de-escalation, or convey the futility of further military actions through messaging. Current US deterrence strategy within the space domain is mostly irrelevant, in my view, for addressing competition between China and the United States. Due to mirror imaging, and that includes deterrence by punishment, and lacks utility once conflict begins. So I've just described the problem. Your last two questions, basically come down, what should we do? I propose a comprehensive space deterrence strategy, which I'll lay out. It includes the requisite deterrence by punishment. So I'm not saying you don't need to be able to have deterrence by punishment or break things. Hopefully not debris generating. But militaries need to be able to do that. But it promotes more dissuasion efforts to increase strategic options for leadership. Dissuasion objectives can be achieved through non-military means, as Snyder suggested, although dissuasive effects can be imparted through general military preparation. So I'm going to lay out 4 specific ones. We need to update our strategies and our doctrine. It should reflect that deterrence, or affecting the decision calculus of an opponent, spans the continuum of conflict from peace to war to achieve national aims across all the instruments of national power, diplomatic, informational, economic, and military. Also, the United States has advantage when we look at our rivals or opponents of Russia and China. We have more allies than they do. We also have a better commercial industry. We need to take advantage of what we have as a strategic advantage in our strategies and our doctrine. We need to include them to convey the futility of action. Number 2, we need to include all aspects of space mission assurance and resilience. Doug Lavera, I saw you were out there. I'll mention the 2015 white paper you did. But dissuasions activities help convey the ineffectiveness of an attack against space architectures and discourage military competition in the first place. That's powerful stuff. So the good news is for the space professionals, the members of the Space Force, that's the realm of mission assurance and resilience. I won't go through the laundry list of what they are, but the United States, to include more, we talk about proliferated LEO a lot. Mission assurance and resilience is more than proliferated LEO, even though it's key, but you need to incorporate all the elements of mission assurance resilience. So distributed all-domain solutions, diversified space capabilities of allies and commercial partners, protected satellite communications, and onboard deception measures, to name a few, would fall into that. 3, we need to field on-orbit debris removal capabilities. The Defense Space Strategy states the U.S. national security and prosperity require unfettered access to and freedom to operate in the space domain. That is the mission. That is the requirement. We have lots of debris up there, 500,000 pieces, a marble or larger, a lot of that in LEO. We need to address this problem using the Joint Capabilities Integration Development System process, otherwise known as JCIDS, or whatever future alternative acquisition system that comes out. Space Command acquisition professionals should define a capability need for on-orbit debris removal to support the warfighting requirement of accessing and use space. We say that's what we need to do. Debris, an indiscriminate obstacle to that, we need to address it. Critics may point out, hey, Patsy, we don't really have the technology to do that. That doesn't matter. That's not how capability gaps or needs are addressed. So yeah, there's undetermined costs, the technology. I would just point to other technologies. This is standard. We need to identify what the gap is, capability need, whether it needs a material or non-material solution to address the on-orbit. Okay, and like most technologies, it will mature in time. But we need to develop a trusted attribution framework. Nate, can you push the triangle graphic? Are you able to do that? Cool. So, you know, a credible and trusted space attribution process or ability to trace the origin of an action against space architecture underpins a successful space deterrence strategy, especially one incorporating deterrence by punishment. It's because before one can respond to harmful interference and attack against space architectures, it must be determined that an attack actually occurred and along with the source of attack. You can't just say, you don't get attribution. You don't just miraculously know something happened on orbit and who did it. So what you're seeing here is a graphic. I kind of stole this from the nuclear community, the National Technical Nuclear Forensics, and kind of tailored it to space. But you have, you need to know what's happening in space, whether it's space domain awareness or SSA. You need to have the forensics capability to gather evidence that is admissible in court because you may need to act on it or for other nefarious means, take it through the court system. You need to leverage the intelligence community. And again, one of your strategic advantages is allies and commercial partners. That brings a lot of trust that we've developed a trusted attribution framework. So I'm recommending the National Space Defense Center representatives should develop, rehearse, and refine a credible space attribution framework, which includes space domain awareness, forensics, as you see on there. So to wrap up, the United States has had the luxury of only needing a good enough space strategy, right? So, you know, we muddled our way through. Things aren't so bad. You know, this strategy was basically the effectiveness and efficiency did not matter as much because of the relative space supremacy, dominance, whatever you want to pick, that the United States enjoyed. With the reemergence of great power competition, this luxury no longer exists. So I'm proposing a comprehensive approach. It remains relevant throughout the continuum of conflict, peace, and war, and maximizes the protection of national security interests in space and other domains. Moreover, there's an unintended value to this approach. It's not all about war fighting and protecting national interests, even though it's important. A strategy incorporating substantial dissuasion efforts provides additional space capabilities and services through mission assurance resilience, allies and partners, encourages greater cooperation with allies and commercial partners, and enhances space sustainability. As a result, more of the global community can enjoy the benefits that space affords. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Wow, those are some really good points and good segues to both Brian and Frank, but we'll go with Brian next. Go ahead, Brian.
Thanks, appreciate it. I appreciate the event for inviting me to participate in the event today. So I'm gonna pick up a couple of themes that have been talked about so far and sort of expand on those. So first I'll say, I'll express what is probably, at least for what we heard from this panel so far, more of a contrarian view. I think, you know, a lot of the cislunar, Moon, Mars stuff is very overblown. And I would say from a strategy standpoint, it is, you know, investing a lot into that is going to be probably a money suck for the next several decades. So if that is something that we're thinking about doing as far as something that's going to reap these massive economic benefits in 10 years or so, I would very much caution against that. But I think there are a lot of issues to think about in this discussion of space power, and there's certainly lots of things from, you know, science and exploration and the reasons to think about the moon and Mars and other sorts of expectations. Just to point out that, you know, from an ROI perspective, ROI perspective, because in a near term of 10, 20 years, That's really lots of big questions whether or not that's going to return. So thinking back to the space power stuff sort of in general, I think there's more than enough issues to deal with just in the Earth orbit, into a little bit into cislunar space that we're already sort of trying to grapple with. I'm going to riff on a couple of things that themes that Mir and Patsy both brought up, just sort of expand on that a little bit. There's often here, and you think about talking about from a power perspective, four main components of that, right? There's the diplomatic, information, military, and economic. We used to call it DIME. I think the biggest challenge, back to the questions that Nate originally posed, is right now, 90% plus of the money, the attention, and the people the U.S. puts into space power is all under that M, that military category, right? We've got the Space Force, we've got Space Command, a huge amount of political attention and just people hours and time has gone into those. They together encompass at least 15 billion in annual spending, just in the unclassified budget, probably a lot more when still in the classified budget. Thousands working towards tens of thousands of people. That is orders of magnitude more money and people than State Department, Commerce Department, Transportation Department, all the other agencies have. The exception of NASA, right? Because NASA's got about $20 billion or so, but they have a very specific part of this. I'm talking about the other agencies within the government who enable things like the economic prosperity and the development of the commercial sector and sort of, engaging diplomatic, I'll say diplomatic competition with Russia and China. Those parts are severely under-resourced and constrained. So that is one thing I would sort of, for the first point to make is, right now we tend to focus almost exclusively on military as the answer to all this, at least from a federal government standpoint. And I'll say we need to expand our horizons a little bit and think about the other agencies that are involved and how to properly enable them. Second, I'll just echo some of the comments that Patsy just made on deterrence. I don't think we've got a good handle on what space deterrence is. Secure World ran a workshop on space deterrence back in 2009, 2010 timeframe. I know National Defense University and a few others also did work back then on space deterrence. And yet here, 10 years later, and I think if you ask someone what, how do we deter stuff in space, or what is the theory of space deterrence, you're going to get a variety of answers that, and some of those perspectives not really be very well informed, certainly nowhere near where we were with our thinking on nuclear deterrence. So, part of that is that a lot of this discussion has been on deterrence has been happening behind closed doors in SCIFs. And I kind of understand a little bit of that because of just the sensitivity around space. But if we're talking about a national strategy, a whole of government approach, that can't just happen behind a SCIF between a very limited crowd and just in the national security world. It has to bring in all those other departments and agencies. It has to bring in industry. And so it has to happen beyond just what's happening behind that SCIF. You've got to bring in allies, industry, other components of government. So a little more on the deterrence thing. We hear that quite a bit nowadays from top military leadership in the Space Command, Space Force, that they're deterring attacks. But when you start to peel back that onion a little bit, how are they deterring? The number one things as well, we're going to get stronger, right? That brings back echoes of what Patsy just talked about, well, I'm going to have a bigger boxer than you are, and I'm going to deter by threatening a retaliation. I fully agree with Patsy's view on this. I'm not sure that's the best way to put it out, right? I think we should be focusing more on sort of at the core resilience and dissuasion sort of a deterrence approach rather than a retaliation approach. And that has actually been central U.S. policy since the 2011 National Security Space Strategy, is this focus on deterrence by denial and what we call resilience. But, if you look back at what have we done to implement it over the last decade, it's really hard to put your finger on specific ways we've been able to implement that strategy. So I'll say, recap, we need a little more public discussion of this whole space deterrence, including with Congress, if we're really going to get everyone on the same page and sort of have a national agreement on how we're going to go together with this whole of government, national endeavor. And then finally, I'll just say that, as we look towards this issue of space power and bringing in all four elements, DIM and E, to bear on that, I'm just going to recap a couple of recommendations from a small study team I led as part of a Office Net assessment project back in 2015, 2016. We were asked to specifically look at the DI and E aspects, and our main goals and recommendations were in line with that. One is that we should, the goal should be to have a vibrant commercial space sector, leads innovation. Our goal should be the space environment that is increasingly transparent and predictable, increasingly normalized set of rules for military activities in space, and flexible international regional partnerships with empowered allies. And a lot of those are sort of things that we're doing some of those, but I wouldn't say we're doing necessarily in a holistic or in a very good manner. So a couple of ways we could do things better, what I'll close with. One of those is even closer alignment with what the commercial sector is doing. Right now, we still have a lot of, well, the DoD is thinking about or talking about how to leverage industry, but there's not really a lot of close alignment there. US should be a force for increased order in space, not disorder. We should be pushing for that international rule of law. More muscular diplomacy to counter some of the propaganda efforts we're seeing from Russia and China. And also, I would say, taking our international partners more seriously. That's not just, saying, bringing them along to say that we have them, but to actively involve them in creating architectures, in talking with them about joint and combined capabilities that we can actively bring together, which is a bit different than how we've done things in space in the past. So I will stop there. Look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Brian. Those are really good points, especially on the diplomatic point. The SAIS review just published this week a very interesting report on how to measure diplomatic capacity. And that's an important step. And that's also actually a very good segue over to our diplomat on the panel, Frank Rose. Why don't you bring us home?
Great. Thanks so much, Nate. And let me thank MITRE for inviting me today. And it's great to serve on a wonderful panel with these experts. I'd like to focus my remarks this morning trying to answer one of the nation's most pressing national security questions. How does the United States effectively manage China's rise in outer space? This is a very complicated question and doesn't lend itself to an easy black or white answer. So in my presentation, I'm going to attempt to accomplish two things. One, define the challenge, and two, outline a potential strategy for managing it. Let's begin by defining the challenge China's rise in outer space presents to the United States and its allies. In many ways, the United States and its allies face a fundamental dilemma with regard to China and outer space. On one hand, China's development of anti-satellite weapons represents a direct threat to the US and allied space systems. The Pentagon's new 2020 Chinese military power report, released earlier this month, highlights the importance that China is attaching to anti-satellite and counter-space systems. The report states, the People's Liberation Army continues to acquire and develop a range of counter-space capabilities and related technologies, including kinetic kill missiles, ground-based lasers, and orbiting space robots, as well as expanding surveillance capabilities, which can monitor objects within their field of view and enable counter-space actions, end quote. Why is China developing these anti-satellite or counter-space capabilities? I think the answer is very simple. China understands that space-based assets are key to the ability of the United States to project power globally. And by denying the United States access to space-derived data, China would gain significant military advantage. On the other hand, the United States, China, and other spacefaring nations face a set of common challenges with regards to the long-term safety and sustainability of the outer space environment. The biggest of these challenges is the growth of orbital debris. As we've discussed earlier today, the United States Department of Defense currently tracks about 26,000 objects in outer space, 10 centimeters or larger, in various Earth orbits. And because of the high speeds these objects travel, if there is a collision between a piece of debris and a spacecraft, it could create clear problems. Now, some of the debris is the result of routine operations, while other are the result of deliberate acts and accidents. Two most significant debris generating events in recent years was China's 2007 anti-satellite test against one of its own satellites and the Iridium Cosmos collision in 2009. These two events are responsible for approximately 1/3 of the orbital debris in low Earth orbit. In addition to orbital debris, we're also starting to see the rise of mega constellations of small satellites. As many of you are probably aware, SpaceX has begun launching its Starlink constellation. The initial constellation will be 12,000 small satellites. My understanding is SpaceX has asked the FCC to approve an additional 30,000 satellites for a total of 42,000 satellites in the constellation. And it's not just US-owned entities that are developing mega constellations. Chinese entities are beginning to enter the game as well. And while these mega constellations have the potential to improve space-based capabilities, they will also contribute significantly to the congestion of low Earth orbit. The growth of orbital debris and the rise of mega constellations of small satellites are major problems that need to be addressed. And it is hard to see how we will address these challenges without some level of cooperation with China and Russia. Recognizing this dilemma, let me outline a couple of recommendations that I think the US government should implement. First, the United States must continue its efforts to enhance deterrence and increase the resiliency of its space systems against the growing anti-satellite threat. On this point, I think both the Obama administration and the Trump administration have done a good job with their various space security initiatives over the past several years, such as increasing funding for resiliency of our national security space systems, establishing the US Space Force, and reestablishing US Space Command. Second, we must expand cooperation with our allies on space security. In this competition with China, the US global system of alliances and partnerships is one of its key asymmetric advantages from both a political and a capabilities standpoint. You know, one particular initiative I would continue to push is the idea of hosting US payloads on allied satellites like we're doing with Japan. Additionally, as we stand up the Space Force and US Space Command, my hope is cooperation with allies is at the center of the organization. Third, the United States should work with the broader international community, including China, to develop stronger norms of behavior. One of the steps that I would recommend is to develop some type of international ban or limitation on further debris generating events in outer space, like China's 2007 ASAT test. Indeed, I would say the United States had some very productive discussions with China in the 2016 timeframe on norms. Fourth, and building on the previous point, the United States must do a better job engaging China diplomatically on outer space security issues. One of the easiest things we could do would be to restart the US-China space security talks, which I founded and led during the Obama administration. Based on my understanding, these talks were last held in 2016. And finally, the United States should identify ways to cooperate with China on pragmatic civil space projects. The United States will need both carrots and sticks if it is going to effectively manage China's rise in outer space. Believe me, I have no blinders on with regards to China in space. I've dealt with them for many years, and I fully understand that the Chinese civil space program is a wholly owned subsidiary of the People's Liberation Army. So any type of cooperation would need to be carefully calibrated to ensure that civil cooperation did not contribute to China's military space program. However, if the United States was ultimately able to find a way to cooperate with the Soviet Union on civil space projects at the height of the Cold War without undermining national security, we should be able to find a way to cooperate pragmatically with China. So let me conclude with the following points. As the 2017 U.S. National Security Strategy correctly states, we have indeed returned to an era of great power competition with states like Russia and China. But as my colleague Tom Wright has written in his excellent book, All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, quote, as the United States competes with Russia and China, it cannot lose sight of the many areas in which the United States must cooperate with its rivals out of shared interests. The issue is whether it is possible to cooperate on these problems while competing on others. This is the essential balance, in my view, we need to strike regarding outer space. Finding a way to work cooperatively with states like Russia and China on space safety and sustainability issues, while at the same time pushing back on security issues where necessary. So let me stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Frank. Well put, especially on the balance between a peace through strength and a peace through friendship approach, the motto of the diplomatic corps. So with that, we're going to move now to the Q&A, and why don't we start with Dr. Townsend? Do you have a question for the panelists?
Several. They brought up a lot of very interesting issues during that that discussion, and I pointed out several questions I wanted to ask. Skipping back to Dr. Harrison, you said that China sees space predominantly as an information domain in addition to a physical domain, and that it's represented in their military structure. How would you change the organization of the U.S. military structure to achieve the same end? Combine Cybercom and Spacecom, regenerate Stratcom with a different mission set?
I wouldn't, because I think that the Chinese, conception of space as primarily an information domain is short-sighted. So I think in the long run, I think they may have organized themselves in a way that's not going to compete, in fact, effectively with the United States or others, as space becomes more of a physical domain, certainly in the way that we are using it in the future. So, sorry to counter the premise of the question, but I would not try to mimic China in this regard.
That's fine. I'll pass it over to Paul. We'll go back and forth. Paul, you can ask the next one.
Yes, I've noticed several questions from the audience on there's classical legal frameworks for maritime and air traffic control and things like that. And the questions were, how would these be applicable maybe to the space environment? Now, let me give a few different spins on that. I know there's a lot of people who talk about using the military using commercial assets, but no one's ever mentioning the fact that if the military is using commercial space communications or even ISR, that these become targets, legal targets in any subsequent conflict. One might even be able to argue that there's many commercial satellites like Intelsat that are used to transmit the UAV control from Iraq and Afghanistan to controllers in Nevada. And does that make the, let's say, Intelsat ground controllers in France or something like that legal targets? Because they're part of the kill chain. Also, a lot of people talk about air traffic control and would, you know, can we implement that for space traffic control? And, you know, that makes sense to some degree, because that implies that satellites are under control. And in some sense, there are many weekly encounters, close encounters of different satellites or space junk or something coming near to each other just by the normal orbital dynamics. So I'm not sure how you exactly control that. And you can talk about the air traffic control, but I'm not sure how much that is implemented in times of war. You have a special forces plane going in on some covert mission, they're not going to register their flight plan with the, you know, the commercial civil authorities. The same way, if there's some sort of special mission, let's say the latest in thing that everyone on the block, so to speak, has to have in space are the inspector satellites. And they go through a lot of effort to try to hide where those are going, and you're not going to register a space orbital flight plan with that. So there's, in time of war, I think there's many exceptions. You do have some past legal frameworks for like merchant marines where you used commercial ships that were pre-configured for military use, you know, during World War I and World War II. And so maybe there is some legal framework. But anyway, just based on some of those opinions, I open that up to the board here. And if anyone has further comments based on what the various questions, I think it was 4 or 5 questions along those lines.
Well, why don't I start, if that's okay? I think you're absolutely right. There are 2 separate rules for wartime and peacetime. Once a conflict breaks out, and I'm not a lawyer, but I've spent a lot of time with lawyers over the years, the law of armed conflict would apply to operations in outer space. The more interesting question from my perspective is peacetime operations. And my view is, if you look at a lot of the previous codes of conduct, like the 1972 Incidents at Sea Agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, the objective of those norms and codes was to reduce the risk of misperception and miscalculation, so we did not create an accidental conflict. So what I would recommend that the United States and the international community as a whole do is really focus on pragmatic risk reduction methods that can do 2 things. One, limit an accidental collision or something along those lines, so enhanced SSA cooperation, and also find ways to reduce the amount of debris in outer space. One of the things I like to say about debris is that it does not discriminate. And a piece of debris from China's ASAT test in 2007 can come close to a Chinese satellite. And furthermore, and this is a really important point, is that if you look at the history of space security, the biggest advances have occurred when there was a link between maintaining the long-term sustainability of the space environment and security of the space environment. For example, the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty, that was an environmental treaty, but it also was a security treaty. And one of the things that treaty did is it prevented nuclear weapons tests in outer space. Same thing with the UN debris mitigation guidelines. So focusing on that link between preserving the environment and security, I think is something where we can make some progress. So again, law of armed conflict will deal with, once conflict occurs, but we could spend a lot of useful time developing useful risk reduction methods to reduce the risk of conflict in peacetime. Thanks.
Certainly.
If I quickly respond to you, Paul. So in a sense, we also need to think about, for instance, in your slides, you pointed out that you can actually win a war in space, or you can keep it limited to space in terms of targeting each other's assets for power demonstration purposes. But I was thinking through that, and I was wondering that in that case, isn't it also true that your ground-based space support systems become legitimate military targets? Because it might not stay limited in the space domain. It might extend to Earth as well.
Okay. Do we have any other comments to Paul's questions?
I'll just give a quick one. So when we play some of these tabletop scenarios or war games, commercial sector supports the military and the other domains. They've been doing it for decades. This is nothing new. So land domain with commercial transportation, maritime domain, commercial transportation. We shouldn't think that just because there's commercial companies supporting military activities, there's some low-at concerns. You got to understand where you are in that decision cycle. But we've been doing this for decades, and the space domain, we're finally coming to terms with it, but it's nothing new.
I think we have time for one more question. Let's go with Kevin. Do you have one for us?
I sure do, and hopefully this builds on what John was just talking about. So one of the fascinating pieces that we've all danced around, but really haven't talked too much about, is how space is really a pan-governmental issue. But we're not organized as a government necessarily to have all the aspects of our government infrastructure engaged at one time. So how do we do that a little bit better? And we have a thoughtful question from Dennis Murphy. More or less it says, once we get to the space domain, it's not as easy to recognize the difference between a military mission and a civilian mission or a commercial economic mission. So this concept of dual use and how do we distinguish? The question is it possible to effectively compete militarily in space without militarizing civilian infrastructure in orbit and beyond? And Frank, maybe that's a good question for you to start with, unless there's somebody who's super anxious to jump in beforehand.
Who do you want to start?
Frank.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't get it 100%.
Yeah, given that once you get to space, missions, as we know very well, are very difficult to distinguish between as truly either civilian or economic commercial or government non-military and a military. So how do we get that dual use nailed down? And given that blurred line, how would you recommend that we position ourselves to effectively compete militarily without having to militarize our civilian sector infrastructure and their missions?
Kevin, that's a great question. And it really goes to the heart of why it's been so difficult to negotiate space arms control agreements, because fundamentally, many of these space systems are dual capable. A story I like to tell is that the Soviets claimed that the mechanical arm on the space shuttle was actually an ASAT weapon. So, my focus would be to work in the international community to develop norms of behavior that focus on actions versus capabilities. There has been some progress on that, specifically the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space long-term sustainability guidelines. That's been a good norm building exercise. The EU had their proposed international code of conduct, which failed for a variety of reasons. So that's where, I would focus my attention. But the bottom line, answer to your question, it's really hard given the dual capability nature of these systems.
I've brought up a really important point that's connected to a second question about red lines. So red lines from memory, code of conduct when that was under negotiation, this concept of red lines, that line beyond which you will not cross for militarization. Is that something you think also better addressed with norms rather than policy and other incentives?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Anyone with a response?
If I can jump in here. So I think one of the major pieces I think that's been brought up is you can't be space power without a robust space industry, right? So that's important. The other thing that I think your discussion mentioned in previous ones too is we constantly talk about cooperation within the government, cooperation with the civil side, and then the commercial side and so forth. We need to get beyond cooperation. We need to start talking about integration, okay? Because our global competitors are integrating. They're integrating, like you mentioned, between commercial, states, and military. They're also integrating with various initiatives around the world with belts and roads and all kinds of other pieces. And you see ground stations being set up in Brazil, where how do we look at that, right? It calls into question our idea of the Monroe Doctrine. If we do apply it to space, how would that be? So all of that. And what is, I think, important to understand with the deterrence aspect is, we need to look at reconstitution. We got to make it costly for our adversaries and our competitors. We need to make it unattractive for them to hit us. We need to look at indemnification, right? Do our adversaries look at our commercial services as extensions of the military? And if they do, then we need to look at theirs as well. And then we need to prepare for that, right? We need to make our infrastructure a public thoroughfare so that adversaries don't want to destroy the capabilities that might affect blue forces, gray forces, and even potentially some red forces, right? We need to leverage our asymmetrical power and use that as a deterrent factor to our adversaries so that they know in space we have the ultimate asymmetrical power. And then we need to do cost and positional strategies, making it very costly for them to keep up with us, making and deploying small sats at lower cost, important than potentially having weapons, right? I'm not against weapons, but these are things that we need to think about. Box. Over.
Yeah, I have a quick response to the norm building. So in a sense that if you think about space as a contested domain, or for instance, you have a base on the moon where you're extracting resources and you have several contenders for that. So the key question that we as a space strategic community need to think of is that, is a participant nation signing on to agreements and actually meeting those norms? So an example could be China's behavior in the South China Sea. China signed on to a code of conduct vis-a-vis ASEAN countries. If you read the draft code of conduct, the first point was that there will be no building of any physical presence in the South China Sea disputant islands. And President Xi, when he met President Barack Obama in 2015, reassured President Obama that there is nothing physical being built. But then you see that just a month later, you have physical attributes built in the disputed island. So that would happen with any other country who would probably behave that way as well. So I think the key questions that we are grappling with today, given the fact that I said the space discourses change from just flags and footprints to presence and extraction and settlement, I think it's important to realize that there is a conversation going on, not just in the US in terms of utilization, but China is actually going to come out with its space national law this year, according to the head of the China National Space Administration. India is thinking about its law. So those are the questions that we actually need to grapple with in terms of the future of space that we have. And finally, the question, I think some of the questions in the chat are interesting. For instance, if your goal, for instance, the National Space Council has come up with a vision that we are looking for presence on the lunar surface, permanent human presence. Now, if that is really the goal, and if that is the articulated goal for the next 20 or 30 years, are your institutions aligning to those goals? For instance, would you then have to have a duty of enabling cislunar access? Would you have a duty of presence? I think these questions actually need to be grappled with, and it's already happening in countries like China and India to a very large extent.
Thank you, Dr. Goswami. With that, we're a little bit over time, but if there's one more comment that the panelists would like to make before we close. Anyone? Okay. I want to thank our panelists today for joining us. Thank you to MITRE as well for hosting this very important and timely discussion. We could go on all day with this group, and I would love to do that. But we are at our end. So thanks again for joining us, everyone, panelists and audience alike. Have a great day.